December 17, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest was a tomb of snow and silence. Fog coiled around frozen trees, muffling the rumble of engines crawling west. To the men of the 5th Panzer Army, this was no ordinary movement, it was destiny's final throw of the dice. The German High Command had promised one last victory, one final miracle to split the Allied front in two. The plan had a name, Walk dem Rhein. To Berlin, it meant salvation. To the soldiers who would fight it, it meant sacrifice. Colonel Hans Kruger, commander of an armored regiment, stared through his frost-covered windshield as the first tanks rolled forward. He was a veteran of 2 wars, a man who had seen empires rise and collapse under the weight of logistics and fuel. Now, he watched history repeat itself, slowly, painfully, predictably. Behind him, panthers and tigers grumbled like starving beasts. Their fuel tanks were nearly empty before the battle even began. The once invincible Wehrmacht now measured its reach in liters of gasoline. Every kilometer gained meant another dozen lost to exhaustion. Still, Kruger obeyed. Orders from Berlin were clear: advance west, seize American fuel depots, and keep the offensive alive. In the frigid air, the smell of diesel and desperation mixed like gunpowder and prayer. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing against the pale snow. Without fuel, he muttered to his driver, there is no war. Only waiting for death. At 5:30, flares streaked across the sky. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and in that instant, none of the men in the Ardennes, not even Kruger, realized that this offensive would end not with victory, but with a revelation so profound it would haunt the colonel until the day he died. December 18, 1944, near St. Vith, Belgium, a pale sun rose over the snow-choked Ardennes, turning the ice to silver. The forest echoed with the growl of engines as German armor pushed west. For the first time in months, the soldiers felt the rhythm of victory again. They sang, joked, and told themselves that this was the beginning of something great. Colonel Hans Kruger rode in the lead half-track, scanning the road through a cracked windshield. All around him lay the ruins of an American convoy, burnt trucks, shattered crates, and frozen corpses buried under frost. The air stank of gasoline and smoke. Fuel, Herr Oberst! Shouted a sergeant, pointing to rows of jerrycans stamped U.S. Army. Enough for the whole column. Mechanics ran forward, draining every can they could find. The tanks drank greedily, engines roaring back to life. For a brief hour, the men felt unstoppable. The panzers thundered west again, snow flying from their tracks. Kruger watched them go, his face unreadable. By evening, the illusion began to fade. Radio reports crackled, bridges destroyed, roads jammed, fuel trucks missing. The captured gasoline was running out already. Every kilometer west burned another hour of life from the offensive. That night, Kruger spread his maps on a farmhouse table. The red arrows looked bold, certain, but he saw the truth behind them. Germany was advancing on borrowed time. A young lieutenant tried to smile. Maybe we'll reach Antwerp before the fuel runs dry. Kruger looked up, weary eyes glinting in the lamplight. We won't reach Antwerp, he said quietly. We'll reach the bottom of our tanks, and that's where Germany ends. Outside, the winter wind moaned through shattered trees. The engines still rumbled in the distance, but to Kruger, it already sounded like the echo of defeat. December 19, 1944, outskirts of Stavelot, Belgium. The snow fell heavier that morning, softening the thunder of engines. Kruger's regiment crawled forward through the blinding white, running on what little fuel they had stolen the day before. The men no longer sang. Every tank commander watched his gauge as if it were a heartbeat counting down to death. Then, near a bend in the road, a scout came rushing back, his face red from the cold. American depot ahead. He shouted. Thousands of fuel barrels, untouched. For the first time in days, Kruger smiled. He ordered his column to advance at full speed. Through the trees, they saw it, a cluster of warehouses and trucks half buried in snow. Guarded by only a handful of surprised American soldiers, the attack was over in minutes. Gunfire cracked, echoing through the valley, then silence. The Germans surged into the depot, their boots splashing through puddles of oil and melting snow. Endless rows of fuel drums stretched into the fog, each barrel gleamed with white letters, U.S. Army, high-octane fuel, 50,000 gallons, an officer gasped. Enough for everyone. Kruger walked among the barrels, his gloved hand brushing over the smooth steel. Everything was labeled, organized, perfect. Even the American tools were clean, their vehicles lined in rows like toys from a factory. It was the first time he truly saw the scale of the machine Germany was fighting. Refinery, Louisiana, USA, delivered via Le Havre, Red 1 label. He stared at it for a long moment, the snow melting on his helmet. They had crossed an ocean with this fuel, he thought. They had built the ships, the docks, the roads, everything. While Germany struggled to make synthetic fuel from coal, America simply poured victory from its wells. His men cheered as engines refueled, but Kruger felt no joy. He knew now what others refused to see. This wasn't just luck, it was logistics, and no army, however brave, could outrun that kind of power. December 20, 1944, Stavelot, Belgium. The forest was silent except for the clatter of fuel drums and the hiss of engines being filled. German soldiers worked feverishly, sleeves rolled up, faces red from the cold and excitement. For a few precious hours, it seemed as if the impossible had happened. The panzers were alive again. Colonel Hans Kruger stood in the middle of the depot, watching mechanics refuel tanks that had stood useless for days. The snow glowed orange in the firelight from burning crates. He could almost hear Berlin celebrating already, believing this captured fuel would turn the tide of war, but Kruger's instincts whispered something else. He examined the barrels carefully. Tracing his gloved finger across the painted words, U.S. Army high-octane aviation fuel, the labels listed factories, refineries, shipment dates, all perfectly documented. They brought this across the Atlantic, he murmured. Thousands of miles, under fire, in winter. And it's still here, on time. The young officer beside him said, "A miracle of chance?" "No," Kruger replied quietly. "A miracle of industry." To him, every barrel was proof of something greater than any tank or gun, a system so vast it seemed unstoppable. Then, a low drone rolled across the horizon, faint at first, then louder. Kruger's heart sank. "Airplanes," he whispered, moments later. The clouds tore open. Dozens of P-47 Thunderbolts dived like hawks, their engines howling. The first explosion shattered a line of trucks. The second ignited the nearest barrels. Fire erupted, bright as sunrise, racing across the snow, feeding on the very lifeblood they had stolen. The inferno devoured everything. Fuel trucks, supply crates, half-tracks all turned into molten silhouettes against the snow. Men screamed as the air itself ignited. The heat was unbearable, yet the cold wind carried ashes like black snowflakes. Colonel Hans Kruger crawled from the wreckage, his uniform scorched, his face streaked with soot. Around him, what had been a victory now lay twisted and burning, 50,000 gallons of American gasoline erupting into a pyre that lit the Ardennes sky. The Thunderbolts wheeled overhead, their engines fading into the distance. Silence followed, heavy, absolute. Only the crackle of fire and the groans of wounded men remained. Kruger stared at the destruction and felt something hollow open inside him. Not anger. Not even fear. It was realization. They had captured the fuel, yes, but only because the Americans had allowed it to exist. They could afford to lose it. Germany could not. He turned to a young officer clutching his burned arm. "How many trucks do we have left?" "None, Herr Oberst," came the answer. "They're all gone." Kruger stood there for a long time, watching the fuel burn, the symbol of everything Germany no longer possessed. In that moment, he understood what Berlin refused to see. The Allies didn't merely fight wars, they produced them. Every bomb that fell, every bullet fired, every tank refueled, all were born from factories that never slept. As dawn broke over the frozen battlefield, Kruger saw the truth with painful clarity. The war was already over. The Reich still fought battles, but it had lost the one thing that truly decided wars: industry. He whispered to himself, "We fight with courage. They fight with capacity." And as the fires of Stavelot died into smoke, the last hope of the German offensive drifted away with them into the gray winter sky. December 20, 1944. The snow had turned black from soot and oil. The once proud 5th Panzer Army crawled through the forest like a wounded beast. The road was littered with broken tanks, frozen horses, and shattered dreams. Every vehicle that still ran did so on stolen drops of fuel. Colonel Kruger rode in the back of a Kübelwagen, his breath fogging the cracked windshield. The driver clutched the wheel with numb hands, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Around them, soldiers marched in silence, gaunt, frost-bitten men dragging their rifles through slush. They passed what was left of a convoy. A dozen trucks stood abandoned, their tires slashed, engines stripped. Someone had painted on one of them in charcoal, "Ohne Benzin." Kein Krieg. Without gasoline, no war. The words cut deeper than any bullet. Messages from headquarters arrived by courier: hold the line, counterattack, maintain morale. But Kruger knew it was fantasy. Morale couldn't move tanks. Hope couldn't replace fuel. A young lieutenant approached him. "Herr Oberst, we still have a few gallons left. Enough for the headquarters vehicles." Kruger shook his head. "Distribute it among the ambulances. The wounded move first." The lieutenant hesitated. "And the rest of us?" Kruger looked out toward the gray horizon. "We walk." That night, they camped in the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse. The men huddled around burning fence posts, cooking frozen bread over the flames. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the steady thunder of American engines, endless, mechanical, unbroken. Kruger closed his eyes and listened. It sounded like a living thing, a heartbeat of industry that never stopped. He realized then that Germany wasn't just losing to soldiers. It was losing to a machine. As he watched his men fall asleep beside the dying fire, he whispered to himself, "They have fuel for their tanks. We burn furniture for warmth." The difference between victory and defeat had never been so clear. December 22, 1944. Near Stavelot, Belgium, the snow had stopped, leaving a dull gray haze over the forest. Colonel Hans Kruger stood beside a wrecked Panther tank, its cannon frozen mid-turn toward a narrow valley road. Through his field glasses, he saw movement, not a column of panzers, but a river of trucks, stretching as far as the horizon. Each vehicle bore the white star of the U.S. Army. Engines rumbled in rhythm, exhaust fumes rising like ghosts in the winter air. On their sides, words were stenciled in white, "Red Ball Express," hundreds of them, trucks filled with ammunition, rations, gasoline, the lifeblood of war. American drivers, many of them black soldiers from the segregated units, sat tall behind the wheels, laughing, smoking, and shouting over the roar of engines. Even their convoy discipline felt mechanical, practiced, precise, unstoppable. Kruger lowered his binoculars slowly. "This," he muttered, "is how they fight. Not with glory. With movement." His aide, Lieutenant Meissner, glanced at him. "We could strike them here, Herr Oberst. Capture the fuel." Kruger's eyes narrowed. It was madness, but desperation allowed no logic. Their tanks were nearly dry, every drop meant another hour of survival. He gave the order, the German guns opened fire. The first shell ripped through the lead truck, engulfing it in fire. Chaos erupted. Drivers swerved, brakes screamed. Crates of fuel exploded into pillars of flame, but within minutes, the Americans struck back. Armored jeeps gunned forward, .50 calibers blazing. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed out of the clouds, their bombs turning the forest into thunder. Kruger's line crumbled. Smoke swallowed the ridge. Engines sputtered and died, their tanks became metal coffins. When the roar faded, the Red Ball Express kept moving, endless, alive, indifferent. Kruger stared in silence, breath fogging in the icy air. For the first time, he realized Germany wasn't fighting an army. December 23, 1944, near Trois-Ponts, Belgium, the forest that had once hidden them was now a trap. Snow muffled every sound except the groaning of broken engines and the distant rumble of advancing tanks. Colonel Hans Kruger crouched behind a half-buried wall, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. What he saw made his stomach twist. To the north, American columns poured down the roads, tanks, trucks, endless convoys crawling like arteries of steel. The valley below pulsed with movement. Floodlights flickered across the snow, revealing fuel depots, artillery parks, and rows of tents glowing under the night sky. It wasn't chaos. It was organization, vast, mechanical, perfect. The Red Ball Express had arrived in full force. Hundreds of trucks unloaded barrels and crates into waiting depots. Bulldozers cleared paths through the ice, and generators hummed with a steady industrial rhythm. Smoke from field kitchens curled upward, carrying the smell of coffee and warmth. Kruger felt the sting of it, not envy, but realization. "This is their battlefield," he said quietly. "Their strength isn't in numbers. It's in motion." His aide, Lieutenant Meissner, adjusted his helmet. "We could strike their supply line, cut them off, cut them off?" Kruger interrupted bitterly. "They have more trucks than we have soldiers." The colonel knew it was over. The Americans were surrounding them without even firing. The German offensive, built on speed, had run out of momentum and fuel. By dusk, the encirclement was complete. The few remaining panzers were silent, their crews huddled inside for warmth. Snow covered their hulls like shrouds. From the ridge, Kruger could see the glow of Allied depots stretching for miles, a city of light in a sea of darkness. He whispered to himself, they turned war into an assembly line. That night, while his men slept, Kruger wrote in his notebook, we no longer fight the enemy. We fight exhaustion and industry. December 24, 1944, near Trois-Ponts, Belgium, Christmas Eve. The snow fell in heavy, endless silence, covering the bodies, the broken machines, and the dying dream of the Reich. The fires from the previous night's battles had burned out, leaving only black scars in the white landscape. Colonel Hans Kruger stood beside a motionless Panther, its engine frozen solid, its barrel pointing uselessly toward the horizon. Around him, his men moved slowly, their faces gray with exhaustion. The offensive had stopped not from defeat in battle, but from the absence of something invisible and simple, fuel. A messenger arrived on foot, his uniform torn, carrying orders from headquarters. Hold your position, he said breathlessly. Reinforcements are coming. Kruger took the paper, stared at it, then folded it carefully into his coat pocket. He didn't need to read it to know it was a lie. Reinforcements without fuel were ghosts. Orders without supplies were prayers to a dead god. The men asked him what to do. Some wanted to attack, others to retreat. Kruger looked over the barren valley, where American convoys still moved day and night, headlights glowing like a chain of stars. We do nothing, he said. We wait. That night, they gathered in the ruins of a barn. Someone had found an old radio, and faintly, through the static, came the sound of an English broadcast, Christmas music. Laughter, and voices that sounded alive. The men listened in silence. Kruger sat apart, writing in his field journal, we once conquered Europe by movement. Now we cannot move 10 kilometers. Every engine is silent. Every road leads backward. The enemy has turned fuel into power, and power into destiny. He paused, staring at the ink freezing on the page. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the tanks like tombstones. At midnight, he whispered to himself, the war is ending, but not for us. For us, it simply runs out, like gasoline. December 26, 1944, near Stavelot, Belgium, the storm had passed, but the silence that followed was worse. The forest no longer echoed with artillery or engines. Only the creak of ice, the shuffle of boots, and the faraway hum of something alive. American machinery. Colonel Hans Kruger walked among his men, now fewer than 100. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, rifles slung without strength. The last tank had run dry the night before. They had drained every can, every pipe, even cut open fuel lines hoping for a final drop. Nothing remained. At dawn, a scout returned, gasping. They've surrounded us, Herr Oberst. Tanks to the north, infantry to the west. Kruger looked toward the horizon. Through the trees, the sky glowed faintly, not from fire, but from light. The Americans had electricity, warmth, motion. He took out his binoculars. Beyond the valley lay an Allied base, rows of tents, trucks, and cranes unloading supplies from endless convoys. Generators hummed, spotlights swept the snow, and soldiers moved with calm precision. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a city built overnight. Impossible, whispered Lieutenant Meissner beside him. Kruger shook his head. No. Efficient. He watched as American trucks refueled Sherman tanks right beside kitchens serving hot food. Radios crackled, aircraft passed overhead, and new convoys arrived by the minute. The war machine was alive, and it never slept. When the first American patrol approached, Kruger ordered his men to hold their fire. There was no point. Their weapons were useless against an enemy that had turned supply into supremacy. He gathered his officers one last time. We will surrender, he said calmly. Not because we are weak, but because the war has already chosen its victor. No one argued. The men lowered their weapons, too tired to resist. As they marched toward the Allied lines, Kruger glanced back at his frozen tanks half buried in snow. Each one was a monument to the E. December 27, 1944, American Field Headquarters, near Liège. The tent smelled of diesel, paper, and warmth. A small heater hummed in the corner, its orange glow reflecting off polished boots and maps spread across a wooden table. Colonel Hans Kruger sat opposite a young American officer with calm eyes and steady hands. The contrast between them was striking, one worn and gray, the other rested and confident. like a man from a different world, the officer offered him a cigarette. "You speak English, Colonel?" Kruger nodded. "Enough to understand that I've lost." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the steady drone of trucks outside, the endless rhythm of the American war machine. Finally, the officer spoke. "You fought well. But you knew this was hopeless, didn't you?" Kruger exhaled smoke, watching it curl toward the lamp. "Hopeless? No. But pointless, perhaps. We were ordered to move, and we did. Then we stopped, because everything stopped. Without fuel, an army is just men with heavy coats." The officer smiled faintly. "You Germans built fine machines, too fine, maybe. We built enough of them." He reached for a folder and flipped it open. "Did you know, Colonel, that our refineries produce more gasoline in a week than your entire country does in a month?" Kruger looked up, his expression unreadable. "I believe it. I saw your depots." He paused, his voice lowering. "I saw your logistics. You've turned industry into a weapon." The officer leaned forward. "That's the difference, isn't it? You fought with discipline. We fight with distance. We can move farther, faster, longer." Kruger nodded slowly. "And that is why you will always win. You made war predictable, mechanical, efficient. You've removed its chaos." The officer studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "War is chaos, Colonel. We just learned how to organize it." Kruger smiled faintly, crushing the cigarette in an ashtray. "Then that, my friend, is your greatest invention." February 1945, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, the sea was calm, its surface glittering like metal beneath the pale winter sun. Colonel Hans Kruger stood on the deck of a Liberty ship surrounded by silence, the kind that comes only after defeat. Around him, hundreds of German prisoners leaned against the rails, staring at the endless gray horizon. Armed American guards watched them with quiet indifference. For days, Kruger had heard nothing but the steady pulse of the ship's engines. They never stopped. Not once, even in the middle of the ocean, the rhythm of American logistics continued, precise, tireless, mechanical. At night, the guards allowed them to stand on deck and smoke. Kruger looked up at the stars and thought about Germany, the burned cities, the frozen roads, the empty fuel drums. He wondered how something so proud had burned out so completely. One evening, a young sailor approached him. "You were an officer, right?" Kruger nodded. The sailor smiled faintly. "You'll see, Colonel. When we dock, you'll understand why you lost." Days later, he did. The prisoners were herded onto a train bound for a POW camp in Texas. Through the window, Kruger saw a world he could hardly believe: endless lines of factories, railways, oil fields, and towns that glowed even at midnight. Everywhere, there was motion: trucks rolling down highways, freight trains stacked with machinery, cranes lifting steel into the sky. He turned to another captured officer beside him. "This is not a country," he said softly. "It's a machine with a flag." When they finally reached the camp, Kruger stepped off the train and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of earth, fuel, and heat. The guards spoke politely, offered them water, even cigarettes. Everything was organized, efficient, abundant, and utterly foreign to him. That night, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Kruger sat in his barack and listened to the hum of generators outside. March 1945, POW Camp, Texas, USA. The sun burned hotter than any battlefield Kruger had known. The ground was dry, the air thick with dust and heat. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles, surrounding rows of wooden barracks that shimmered in the distance. Yet inside those fences, life felt strangely calm. The camp was organized with military precision. Every barack had a number, every prisoner a role. There were workshops, a library, even a small stage where guards allowed the men to perform plays. The food was plain but plentiful: bread, meat, coffee. Some prisoners joked that they were eating better in captivity than in the Wehrmacht. At first, Kruger didn't believe it. Then he saw it with his own eyes: American trucks arriving daily, unloading supplies with clockwork rhythm. Nothing ran out. Not fuel, not food, not cigarettes. Every day the same routine, every day the same efficiency. He began to study it. He watched how even the guards followed procedure like engineers maintaining a machine. He noted how deliveries came on schedule, how repairs were made before anything broke. It was a culture built on prevention, not desperation. One afternoon, a guard cleaning his rifle struck up a conversation. "You guys fought hard," the American said. "But you tried to fight the future with the past." Kruger looked up from his bench. "And what is the future?" The guard smiled. "Systems, Colonel. We don't win with heroes anymore. We win with schedules." That night, Kruger couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the steady hum of the camp's generators, that same unending pulse of energy he had heard on the ship, in the depots, even at Stavelot before the flames. In the dark, he wrote in his notebook, "They have turned chaos into order. Even their prisons function better than our armies. We built monuments. They built networks." He closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead, powered by a current that never stopped. April 1945, POW Camp, Texas. Spring arrived quietly. The desert winds softened, and green blades of grass began to pierce the dust. Colonel Hans Kruger sat outside the barack, his uniform faded but neatly pressed, his eyes fixed on the American flag fluttering beyond the wire. It no longer stirred anger, only thought. Every day followed the same rhythm. Breakfast at dawn. Work assignments. Roll call. Evenings spent reading or writing letters. There was peace in the repetition, an almost mechanical calm. Yet beneath it, something inside Kruger began to shift. He had started talking with the guards, young Americans from farms and cities he had never heard of. They spoke openly. Even kindly. One of them, a corporal named Daniels, brought him newspapers and sometimes extra coffee. "You know," Daniels said one afternoon, "back home, my dad's factory builds tractor engines. Before the war, he could barely pay his men. Now, he runs 3 shifts a day, all because of this war." Kruger frowned. 3 shifts? Around the clock? Daniels nodded. "That's America, Colonel. We don't stop." The words stayed with him. "We don't stop." They echoed the sound of the Red Ball Express, the hum of the Liberty ship, the rumble of trains through Texas. Everything he had seen from the battlefield to this camp was connected by that same rhythm. America was not a country of individuals, but of moving parts in perfect coordination. In the evenings, he helped other officers write to their families. Many had lost faith, but Kruger's tone changed. His letters no longer spoke of victory, but of learning. He wrote about the machines, the discipline, the strange humanity of the enemy that had conquered without cruelty. One day, a chaplain visited the camp. He asked Kruger if he believed in fate. Kruger answered softly, "No. I believe in systems." That night, he listened to the distant rumble of freight trains beyond the desert hills. May 8, 1945, POW Camp, Texas. The morning began like every other. The desert air was still cool, the camp already awake to the sound of boots on gravel and the low hum of generators. But something felt different, quieter, heavier. The guards moved slower, the prisoners whispered among themselves. Then the announcement came, a loudspeaker crackled over the compound. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a wave of sound, some men cheered, others wept. A few stood frozen, unable to understand what over truly meant. Colonel Hans Kruger remained still, his cap resting on his knee. He stared at the dust beneath his boots, watching the wind scatter it across the yard. Around him, his men looked to him for reaction, but he said nothing. Later that afternoon, the camp commandant gathered the officers in the mess hall. He spoke respectfully, even kindly. "Gentlemen," he said, "your war is finished. But your lives are not. You will soon return home, to rebuild, not to fight." Kruger listened in silence. The words "to rebuild" echoed in his mind. Back home. But what home remained? The Reich he had sworn to defend no longer existed. Cities were ash and stone, families scattered, ideals shattered. That evening, the American guard Daniels approached him at the fence. "It's over," he said simply. "You'll get to go home now." Kruger nodded. "Yes. But which home?" Daniels hesitated, then said, "Maybe the one you build next." The simplicity of that answer struck Kruger harder than any shell ever had. He realized that the Americans were already thinking ahead, production lines converting from tanks to tractors, soldiers turning back into workers. Their victory wasn't only military, it was philosophical. They never stopped moving forward. In his barack, Kruger opened his weathered notebook one last time. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and thoughts, not of battles, but of logistics. October 1946, Bremen, Germany. The ship crept slowly into port under a gray northern sky. Colonel Hans Kruger stood at the rail, clutching a small duffel bag, everything he owned after 4 years of war and 1 year of captivity. Behind him, hundreds of former prisoners watched their homeland come into view. But what they saw didn't look like the country they had left. Bremen was rubble. The docks were twisted skeletons of steel, cranes hung motionless over the black water. Smoke still drifted from distant ruins, and the air carried the bitter smell of ash and rust. Yet, amid the wreckage, something stirred: movement. Civilians were clearing debris, cranes were being repaired. New scaffolds rose from the ground. Even in ruin, Germany was trying to move again. Kruger stepped onto the dock. A Red Cross worker handed him bread and coffee. She couldn't have been older than 20. "Welcome home," she said softly. He managed a small smile. "Home," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were foreign. He walked for hours through the shattered streets. In places where buildings once stood, children played among the stones. Women carried buckets of water. Men repaired roofs, pushing carts full of bricks. No uniforms, no speeches, just work. Quiet, relentless work. It reminded him of something: the sound of engines, the rhythm of order, the idea that power was not in conquest but in continuity. That evening, he found a bench beside a ruined factory. On its rusted gate, someone had hung a handwritten sign: "We will rebuild. We will not stop." Kruger sat for a long time, watching as workers lit torches inside the darkened building. Sparks flew into the night, glowing like stars over the ruins. He opened his old notebook, the one he had kept since the Ardennes, and wrote his final entry: "I once believed war was the test of strength. But true strength is the ability to rebuild after defeat." On 1953, Frankfurt, West Germany, the city hummed with life. Streetcars rattled along clean avenues lined with glass storefronts. New factories stood where ruins once smoldered, their smokestacks rising like monuments not to war, but to work. Colonel Hans Kruger, now gray-haired and slightly stooped, watched it all from a cafe window. He stirred his coffee slowly, listening to the rhythm outside: engines, footsteps, the clatter of construction. It was the same pulse he had heard years before across the ocean, aboard a Liberty ship, in a Texas camp. Germany was alive again. Not in banners or parades, but in production schedules and steel timetables. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, the newspapers called it. But to Kruger, it wasn't a miracle at all. It was imitation. It was understanding. It was the lesson he had carried back in his weathered notebook: motion, not ideology, sustains nations. He worked now as an engineer for a rebuilt manufacturing plant, the same factory where he had once overseen artillery assembly. Now it produced tractors. Machines that plowed fields instead of battlefields. The hum of the assembly line filled the air, steady and strong. One day, a young apprentice asked him, "Herr Kruger, is it true you fought in the Ardennes?" Kruger nodded. "Yes." "Was it terrible?" He smiled faintly. "Terrible. And necessary." The boy frowned, not understanding. Kruger continued softly. "Sometimes, a nation must lose everything before it can understand what truly builds it." At night, he walked home through streets filled with light: electric, bright, uninterrupted. He thought of the freezing forests, of the silent tanks, of the moment when he realized that courage meant nothing without fuel. He paused at a bridge overlooking the River Main, where barges moved slowly beneath him, stacked with coal, iron, and grain. The reflection of their lights shimmered on the water like a constellation. September 1971, Munich, West Germany. Rain drummed softly against the glass roof of the new Deutsches Museum für Technik. Inside, families wandered through gleaming exhibits: engines, aircraft, and the vast chronicle of mankind's machines. Colonel Hans Kruger, now an old man with a cane and silver hair, moved slowly through the crowd. Each step echoed faintly on the polished floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down the years he had borrowed from history. he stopped before a restored American truck, olive green, stenciled with white letters, Red Ball Express, the display plaque read, U.S. Army Logistical Convoy System, 1944 to 1945. Delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to the Allied front. For a long moment, Kruger said nothing. The sound of rain and distant murmurs faded. He could still see it, the frozen valley of Stavelot, the endless column of those trucks roaring through the mist, unstoppable. Back then, he had cursed them. Now, he simply admired them. A young curator approached. "You recognize it, sir?" Kruger smiled faintly. "Yes. Once, I saw hundreds like it, through smoke and disbelief." The curator tilted his head. "You were there?" "Yes. I was on the wrong side of history. But I learned from it." They stood in silence for a moment. The truck gleamed under the museum lights, its metal immaculate, its tires new, its frame unscarred. It looked immortal. Kruger leaned on his cane and whispered, "When I first saw these, I thought they were our doom. I was wrong. They were our teachers." He walked onward, passing displays of turbines, tractors, jet engines, and communication networks, all born from the same idea he had witnessed in America: efficiency as civilization. In another hall, he stopped before a glass case containing a small generator labeled Liberty Ship Power Unit, 1943. Its description spoke of endless operation, of reliability under pressure. May 1981, Bonn, West Germany. The archive was quiet. Dust floated lazily through beams of afternoon light that slanted between rows of wooden shelves. A young historian, Dr. Anna Keller, opened a weathered box labeled Private Journals, Kruger, Hans. 1901 to 1974. Inside lay a single notebook, its cover cracked, pages yellowed, corners brittle from time. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was sharp, disciplined, almost mechanical. Each line recorded observations, not of battles, but of systems, fuel consumption, convoy patterns, labor rotations. The war described within wasn't about glory or ideology, it was about motion and the lack of it, between the notes. She found small reflections written years later: machines have no hate, only purpose. Men should learn from them. Power is not victory. Power is endurance. The enemy taught me not how to fight, but how to function. Anna turned to the final page. It was dated October 3, 1973, just a year before Kruger's death. The ink had faded, but the words were clear: history punished us for our pride. But it also gave us a teacher, the rhythm of motion. I saw the face of defeat and mistook it for death. It was not death. It was transformation. She closed the notebook and sat in silence. Through the window, she could see modern Germany, trains gliding through the city, factories smoking in the distance. The steady hum of commerce filling the air. It was exactly as Kruger had written, a nation rebuilt not by banners, but by balance. Later that evening, she placed the notebook in a museum display under glass. The label read, Journal of Colonel Hans Kruger, 1901 to 1974. Captured during the Ardennes Offensive, 1944. His writings on logistics, order, and endurance influenced early post-war industrial studies.